The secret history of scarcity. Abundance suppressed. What if everything you've been told about scarcity is a lie? What if the limits we've been trained to accept are not natural, but deliberate? From our earliest school lessons to the latest economic theories, we're taught that resources are finite, that competition is inevitable, that someone always loses. But history, if we look closely, tells a very different story. Imagine a world where abundance was not a dream, but a reality, where food, tools, and energy were plentiful, and human ingenuity could flourish without constraint. Now imagine that world was systematically dismantled. This is not utopia, it's a hidden truth, one buried under layers of power, politics, and control, stretching back thousands of years. Long before modern corporations, stock markets, or central banks, ancient societies already faced questions of abundance. How do you store surplus? How do you distribute it fairly? How do you prevent hoarding, or, more dangerously, prevent a select few from taking control? Some civilizations stumbled, some thrived, but one theme persisted. Abundance was never allowed to exist freely. From Mesopotamia to Rome, from the Indus Valley to ancient China, the tools of scarcity were subtly and deliberately woven into the very structures of society. Temples recorded every grain, palace scribes monitored every coin, and governments imposed regulations that ensured not everyone could access the fullness of what was produced. The world's first economies were never neutral. They were instruments of influence. Consider Mesopotamia around 3000 BCE, a civilization famous for inventing writing, law, and the wheel. Yet beneath those celebrated innovations lay something less obvious but far more powerful: a system of resource control. Temples didn't just worship gods, they controlled grain, lent it out at interest, and kept populations dependent on their storehouses. Farmers were not free to keep the surplus of their own labor. Their harvests were a currency, a tool, a lever of power. The first known ledgers of human history were not merely records, they were a blueprint for regulating abundance, ensuring it flowed to those already in power. And Mesopotamia was not unique. Across the Nile, ancient Egypt developed a system where the state, not individuals, determined the flow of resources. Grain was not just food, it was money. It paid laborers, funded construction, and enforced loyalty. Pharaohs controlled not only what people produced, but how they consumed it. A world that could have been rich in innovation and self-sufficiency was tightly bound by centralized authority. Even in the Indus Valley, often hailed as a civilization of equality, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of standardization in weights, trade practices, and urban planning that suggest a controlled flow of goods and resources. These were not chaotic cities. They were engineered systems designed to manage surplus, limit excess, and prevent anyone from becoming too powerful. Abundance existed, yes, but always rationed, always regulated, always framed to serve those at the top. This is the hidden narrative history rarely teaches. Scarcity is not merely natural. Scarcity can be engineered. And for centuries, powerful forces, from kings and priests to emperors and financiers, have actively suppressed abundance, shaping human behavior, economics, and society itself. In this video, we are not just exploring history, we are uncovering a pattern, a deliberate manipulation stretching back millennia. The story of scarcity is the story of power, of how civilizations learned to harness human ambition, fear, and cooperation to ensure that abundance never became everyone's right. And as we trace this secret history, one unsettling question emerges. If scarcity was engineered then, how much of the scarcity we see today is truly natural, and how much is the result of deliberate design?
Section 2. Mesopotamia and the birth of controlled abundance. Approximately 650 words. To understand how scarcity was engineered, we must begin where organized civilization began: Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Often called the cradle of civilization, it gave humanity its first cities, first laws, and first writing. But beneath the surface of innovation lies a far more subtle invention: the systematic management of abundance. In Mesopotamia, surplus was never simply stored or celebrated. It was carefully recorded, tracked, and lent out. Temples, the centers of religious and civic life, were also the centers of economic control. Farmers brought grain to temple storehouses, not as a gift, but as a deposit. That grain would be carefully measured, recorded on clay tablets, and redistributed, but never without strings attached. Borrowing grain meant entering a contract with obligations. Often, a farmer had to repay more than he borrowed, with interest, after the harvest. Interest in Mesopotamia was not a modern invention. It was a tool of influence. A farmer who borrowed 100 bushels of grain might owe 133 at harvest. That extra third wasn't arbitrary. It bound individuals to the temple, ensured continued dependence, and maintained the flow of resources toward those in authority. Surplus, in other words, was never truly free. It was always a lever. And the record-keeping was meticulous. Thousands of clay tablets have survived to this day, each inscribed with debts, loans, and transactions. Some include seals from witnesses, primitive contracts that ensured compliance. These were not mere bookkeeping exercises. They were the DNA of a controlled economy. By managing who received what, when, and how much, the temples dictated who could prosper and who remained dependent. But scarcity is not only about what exists, it's about perception. Mesopotamia understood this implicitly. If too many farmers retained their surplus, the system could be threatened. By regulating distribution, interest, and debt, the temple ensured that resources appeared limited, even when they were abundant. A society that could have enjoyed widespread prosperity instead became structured around obligation and hierarchy. Trade, too, was a carefully managed arena. Caravans crossed deserts and rivers, exchanging textiles, metals, and luxury items. But every transaction relied on the same system of contracts, debts, and authority. Merchants were never fully free. They were bound by seals, by temple oversight, by the rules of the system. Abundance was possible, but only within a tightly controlled framework. The brilliance and the cruelty of Mesopotamian economics lay in its understanding of human behavior. Debt was not merely financial, it was political. A family unable to repay could lose land, livestock, or even freedom. And yet, the system was stabilized by periodic debt forgiveness issued by kings. These resets were not acts of generosity. They were pragmatic tools designed to prevent societal collapse while keeping power concentrated at the top. In other words, Mesopotamia invented the first cycle of controlled scarcity. Abundance harvested, recorded, lent, taxed, and finally reset. This pattern, the management of plenty to enforce dependence, would echo through history, repeated in civilizations from Egypt to Rome. Even the most advanced aspects of Mesopotamian society, from legal codes to trade networks, served a single invisible principle. Controlling resources was controlling power. Temples weren't just religious centers, they were institutions of influence shaping human behavior for generations. Abundance existed, but it was always rationed, monitored, and mediated by those who understood that wealth is most dangerous when left uncontrolled. And so, in the land where civilization was born, the first lesson was learned: scarcity is not an accident, it is a tool. And once humanity discovered how to manipulate abundance, it never truly let go. Section 3. Egypt, Centralized Power and the Illusion of Scarcity. Approximately 650 words. If Mesopotamia taught humanity the mechanics of controlled abundance, Egypt perfected it. Here, abundance existed in abundance, but only as long as the pharaoh decreed it. The Nile River, lifeblood of Egypt's civilization, provided fertile soil, regular harvests, and the promise of plenty. And yet, the people of Egypt rarely experienced this abundance freely. Every loaf of bread, every jar of beer, every sheaf of grain was measured, recorded, and allocated by the state. The Egyptian economy was not designed around individual profit or freedom. It was built to maintain order, sustain the pharaoh's authority, and manage surplus in a way that ensured obedience. Grain became both food and currency. Workers building the pyramids were paid not in coin but in rations, linking their labor directly to the state's resources. Their sustenance and their survival depended on a central system that dictated distribution with precision. State control went far beyond simple accounting. Every year when the Nile flooded and deposited fertile silt across the farmlands, scribes meticulously measured the inundation. They calculated how much land could yield, how much could be harvested, and how much would be stored as tax or redistributed. This was not primitive bookkeeping. It was early economic forecasting, a management of abundance designed to maintain the illusion of scarcity when necessary.
But abundance could not exist without regulation. Farmers might produce more than the state required, yet that surplus rarely stayed in their hands. It was absorbed into the centralized system, redistributed according to need, or withheld to maintain hierarchy. Egypt created an economy where plenty could exist, but only within limits imposed by those in power. Scarcity, even in fertile times, was a matter of design. The pyramids themselves were more than monuments. They were engines of controlled abundance. Tens of thousands of workers required housing, food, tools, and supervision. Organizing these projects required industrial-scale planning, mobilizing resources and labor in a system that maximized output while limiting individual gain. Each stone lifted was a testament to coordination, not individual freedom. Each ration distributed a reminder that abundance came with oversight. Religion and economy were inseparable. Pharaohs were divine, scribes were intermediaries between gods and men, and every transaction reinforced the cosmic order. Paying taxes in grain, labor, or livestock was both economic and spiritual, a demonstration of loyalty, obedience, and dependence. The illusion of scarcity reinforced the power structure. People did not question their limits because they believed them divinely ordained. Yet even this tightly controlled system was fragile. When the Nile failed to flood, when harvests faltered, the illusion of abundance shattered. Famine spread rapidly, threatening both population and pharaoh. Egypt's stability rested on a delicate balance. Too little control, and chaos would ensue. Too much, and innovation and productivity were stifled. Pharaohs had to constantly manage both the flow of resources and the perception of plenty. What makes Egypt remarkable in the story of scarcity is the sophistication of its control. Here, scarcity was not just about economics, it was about psychology. Abundance was possible, but only as a managed resource. The people believed in scarcity because the state ensured they did. This strategy allowed Egypt to thrive for millennia, maintaining order, loyalty, and wealth while tightly regulating who could access what. The pharaoh's control over grain, labor, and food became a template for empires to come. Scarcity was not a failure of nature, it was an instrument of government, an invisible hand guiding human ambition and dependence. Section 4. The Indus Valley. Trust, Standardization, and Silent Scarcity. Approximately 600 words. While Mesopotamia relied on temples and Egypt on divine kings, the Indus Valley civilization took a subtler approach. Stretching across modern-day Pakistan and northwest India, it flourished between 3300 and 1900 BCE. Unlike Mesopotamia's grand ziggurats or Egypt's towering pyramids, the Indus people left behind no glorified monuments to rulers or gods. Yet beneath the quiet streets and meticulously planned cities lay a sophisticated system for managing resources,
a system that controlled abundance without apparent coercion. The cities of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa reveal an astonishing level of organization. Straight roads, uniform bricks, drainage systems, and standardized weights hint at a society that prioritized balance and efficiency. But this was more than urban planning. It was the architecture of trust. Standardized weights and measures ensured that trade was predictable and fair across hundreds of miles. Merchants could exchange goods without fear of deception, and communities could rely on consistent systems of value. Abundance existed, but only as long as everyone adhered to these invisible rules. Trade networks linked the Indus Valley to Mesopotamia, exchanging cotton, beads, metals, and luxury goods for grains, textiles, and finished products. Yet the Indus left behind almost no written record of rulers, taxation, or armies. The scarcity we perceive in their historical footprint is itself a clue. Control did not require kings, priests, or central authorities. Instead, it relied on social contracts, standardization, and collective compliance. Scarcity was engineered not through force, but through silent agreement. This demonstrates a critical principle. Abundance can be managed without overt hierarchy. By enforcing consistency in trade and production, the Indus Valley ensured that resources were distributed predictably. Individuals could not hoard or manipulate surplus because the system itself maintained equilibrium. Here, scarcity was a tool, subtle but effective. The system taught that prosperity without rules quickly becomes instability, and abundance without order threatens society itself. Yet even this elegant balance could not withstand disruption. Around 1900 BCE, the Indus cities declined. Theories point to climate change, shifting rivers, and trade collapse. Without strong centralization, or perhaps without the ability to adapt their decentralized systems, resources became scarce, populations dwindled, and the cities fell silent. The Indus Valley leaves us with a haunting lesson. Even abundance carefully regulated through trust and standardization can vanish when external pressures disrupt the flow. The Indus legacy, however, lived on in principle. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, the Indus model shows that scarcity need not always be enforced through visible authority. It can emerge quietly through systems, agreements, and standards. It can shape behavior, limit excess, and maintain control without overt coercion.
By studying the Indus Valley, we begin to see that scarcity is not merely a product of nature or misfortune. It is engineered through social design, through the subtle regulation of trade, production, and expectation. In this civilization, as in all the others, abundance existed, but it was never allowed to exist freely. It was always mediated, always conditional, always structured. The Indus people remind us that scarcity is a choice as much as it is a circumstance, and once humanity learned to manage it through force, religion, or trust, it would never let go. Every system that followed, from Rome to China, borrowed from these lessons, refining control, manipulating perception, and ensuring that abundance served the interests of the few rather than the many. Section 5. Rome. Economics as an art of power. Approximately 700 words. By the time Rome emerged as a dominant civilization, the management of scarcity had become a refined instrument of power. The empire stretched from the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Britain. Its strength was not only military, but economic. Rome understood that wealth, distribution, and perception could achieve what armies alone never could: control over millions of lives. Coinage became propaganda. Each Roman coin bore the emperor's image, reminding citizens who held authority over their wealth. Taxes extracted from conquered provinces funded public works, armies, and bureaucracies. Trade flourished along the Mediterranean, but merchants operated within tightly regulated contracts and legal frameworks designed to protect elite interests. Scarcity and abundance were both tools, abundance enough to sustain loyalty, scarcity enough to ensure dependence. The Romans perfected the illusion of choice. Citizens could earn, trade, and spend, but always within limits set by the system. Luxury was permitted to maintain social hierarchy, but the majority remained tethered to the empire's economic rhythm. Surplus was never distributed freely. Instead, it was rationed, taxed, and reinvested to reinforce control. Rome also learned a lesson that echoes into modern times. Imbalance leads to collapse. When wealth concentrated in the hands of elites and the flow of conquest slowed, inflation and debt crises followed. The empire's networks faltered, and scarcity became real for millions. The fall of Rome was not simply a military defeat, it was an economic unraveling, a failure to manage abundance responsibly while maintaining the illusion of scarcity. Yet Rome's legacy is everywhere. Modern banking, trade laws, taxation systems, and even the psychological control of perceived scarcity are echoes of Roman ingenuity. And just like Rome, our modern world is built on an architecture designed to make people believe in scarcity even when resources could be abundant. Section 6. The Modern World. Engineered Scarcity. Approximately 400 words. Fast forward to today. Our economy, our finance systems, and even the way we consume are deeply influenced by centuries of engineered scarcity. Digital ledgers, stock markets, supply chains, and credit systems are sophisticated descendants of the clay tablets, granaries, and coinage of ancient civilizations. Abundance exists in potential, yet it is rarely accessible to all. Consider energy, housing, or food production. Modern technology could create abundance on an unprecedented scale, yet systems of ownership, debt, and regulation maintain scarcity as a tool of social and economic control. Just like the temples of Mesopotamia, the pyramids of Egypt, or the coins of Rome, today's scarcity is not always natural. It is a carefully maintained structure designed to manage expectations, behavior, and dependence. When we understand this, a startling question emerges. How much of what we call limited resources is real, and how much is engineered to serve the interests of those in power? History shows that scarcity is rarely accidental. It is cultivated, and it has been used generation after generation to shape societies, concentrate power, and suppress the potential of human abundance. Conclusion: the secret history revealed. Approximately 400 words. The story of scarcity is not just a tale of economics. It is a story of power, control, and human behavior. From Mesopotamia to Rome, from Egypt to the Indus Valley, civilizations discovered the same principle. Abundance must be managed, or it threatens authority. Scarcity is not a natural law. It is a choice, a tool, and sometimes a weapon. And today, as we navigate our own world of finance, technology, and resources, the lessons of history remain profoundly relevant. Understanding how scarcity has been engineered throughout history gives us insight into the structures that govern our lives, and perhaps the opportunity to imagine a world where abundance is not limited by design. If history teaches us anything, it is that abundance is possible, but only if we recognize the systems that restrict it. By learning from the past, questioning narratives of limitation, and demanding transparency and fairness in our economic systems, humanity can begin to reclaim the potential of abundance.